Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am joined by Yong-Soo Chung. He is the founder and CEO at First Class Founders, but he also has a couple different businesses that he has started over the years, and that interestingly led him to starting a 3PL fulfillment business as well. And he has a couple different e-commerce brands, which led to that. And we're going to dive into that story a little bit today and here's some of the intricacies of how that kind of developed and how he ended up where he is today. I think it's a really interesting story with some interesting kind of twists and turns. So, Yong-Soo, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Kevin. I appreciate it, man.
Definitely. Happy to have you on. I've been watching you on Twitter, X or Twitter, I guess, whatever you want to call it these days. And, you know, I was surprised, like, when I saw you tweet something about having a 3PL in addition to all the other things you're doing. So I was very intrigued and very interested to get you on the show here. So I guess for people maybe that are not familiar with you, haven't followed you yet, you should follow him, I will say. Tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're all about.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I have 3 businesses right now. I guess a 4th one, if you count my podcast, First Class Founders, and my newsletter as a business, which I guess, you know, it's starting to get some sponsorship revenue. So, but three main ones that I've built over the last 8 years. The first business is called Urban EDC, and it's an e-commerce shop selling pocket knives, flashlights, multi-tool spotted openers, you know, things like that. Mm-hmm. The second business my wife and I started was around our French Bulldog, who gained a big following on Instagram. And so he's at Spotted Humphrey on Instagram, and he's a really funny and awesome little dude. And yeah, once we got an audience for him, we decided to launch a second e-commerce brand called Spotted by Humphrey, named after him. And so, yeah, so those 2 commerce shops, and then also have the 3PL, like you mentioned, which kind of honestly was born naturally out of our own frustrations in the 3PL space at the time. And yeah, we've grown that. We moved into a 39,000 square foot warehouse near where I am now, which is in San Francisco. And so, yeah, that's been, you know, a fun journey. Obviously, a lot of unexpected ups and downs and surprises, but that kind of comes with the course of building your own business. So yeah, that's kind of, you know, in a nutshell, like what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, I listened to your podcast and I heard the story, kind of the whole story about how you ended up where you are now. And it's a lot of different twists and turns. It's pretty interesting. But I'm curious, why don't you tell us a little bit about, because I think a lot of times too within the, you know, 3PL and fulfillment space, we talk about finding a niche, and really that's like, as you're a smaller or boutique type 3PL, like that's the way to kind of win and be able to gather that kind of market share. But you did something pretty interesting with how you found your niche initially with the urban EDC, from what I heard on the podcast. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about how you landed on that, and maybe tell us too, because I was not familiar with this EDC community. I thought that was, to be honest, when I first heard EDC, I was like, oh, I think that's something to do with like electronic music, maybe. So yeah. So tell us a little bit about that. But how did you find like that niche to be within that?
Yeah. So there is a show in Vegas called Electric Daisy Carnival, which is probably what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
And actually I've been to it, so I actually know about it. But the everyday carry community is quite strong. And it's a niche community, but there's all these shows that happen during the year, and people kind of they meet up, and it's kind of funny because you recognize people from, they're mostly on Instagram, but you see them in real life, and you kind of bond with them and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's a very passionate community, and a lot of them are like collectors, and so it's really not even about the products themselves. Obviously, the products are what people are looking for, but then it's really about the connections and kind of the, I guess, the interactions you have with the makers directly. And so these makers will they'll make like 10 to 15 things of one item, and it'll sell out really fast. And so it's kind of like this gear drop model where every week we drop new inventory, and it'll sell out really quickly, and things like that. So yeah, in terms of the niche, I was just interested in it. I was working in corporate at a cryptocurrency company in 2014, and I really felt like, this was an area that I was interested in, like flashlights. What's funny is I was not into pocket knives at the time, but I eventually got into it, and now I appreciate it for the design aspects of it, which is like, there's so many little details that goes into designing a pocket knife. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of how I chose it, because I realized that I was interested in it, and I wanted to do something that wouldn't require like a big team, for example. Like, I didn't want to raise VC money. I wanted to do something that was manageable just on my own. And so that's why I thought, using a no-code tool like Shopify, I could spin up a site really fast and then just be able to launch it. Right. So yeah, that was like the first real endeavor that I went into.
Interesting. And then, so you were able to build that out, and you talked about, you just said you leveraged Shopify to be able to build that store. And obviously you've grown it several years later now, and you still have it. So obviously you had some success there, but tell us a little bit about kind of the beginning stages there, when I guess orders started to roll in and you had to figure out how to ship these and start to do that fulfillment. I imagine in the beginning you're probably shipping yourself, and tell us a little bit about kind of that fulfillment journey and figuring that out, especially because it sounds like, based on your background and working for a cryptocurrency company, it didn't sound like you had much experience maybe with shipping in that sense, right?
Yeah, what's funny is I went with a 3PL right from the start, because I thought I needed a 3PL to scale, because I didn't want to be the ones doing the packaging, all that. So I did a ton of research, and this is back in 2015. So the landscape of 3PL was very different back then. But, I did a lot of research, and I found what I had thought was the best 3PL. They had the best ratings, and it was just, they were local, so I could drive, down to South San Francisco where they had a warehouse. And yeah, it was a really sweet setup, I thought. And so I went with a 3PL, but then soon what I realized was that the 3PL industry is very, I guess back then the standard was so low. Like, for example, like I couldn't reach anyone at the warehouse when I called them. Like the mailbox, voicemail box would be full.
Yeah.
There'd be a lot of lost items. And actually one time, one of my customers got a package. When he opened the box, it was an empty box. And so what had happened was, the person shipping the order for that day, it was his last day at work at that 3PL, and he pocketed the item and then shipped an empty box to my customer. And so that was kind of like the last straw. I was like, all right, like I gotta do something here. And so decided to bring fulfillment in-house. And so just started off, just us. And then we were fortunate enough to get a French Bulldog, and we basically launched the second shop, and we just said, okay, well, you know what? Like we already have a little space for our fulfillment. Let's just add these products in, because if you think about it, like we did the same thing that we did with Urban EDC for Spotted by Humphrey, which is the website's obviously different, audience is different, but the behind the scenes back end is all the same, right? So we're like, all right, so we have two shops now. I guess it's like our fulfillment house has 2 internal brands. But then, we were working out of this really unique, it was a storage facility. And the storage facility, you can rent out, these little units, but people were working out of them. So there were a lot of like small e-commerce brands that were just getting started who needed warehouse space. It was almost like a WeWork, but for warehousing space. And so we, just started talking to a lot of brands that were also in the building. And yeah, there were a lot of companies that were also looking for a solution to this because it was not, the 3PL landscape back then was quite lacking. And so we just started shipping for a few of them because they were like, hey, like, looks like you guys are already doing it. Like, can you guys help us with fulfillment? And so that's how we got our first clients. We didn't even have a website. We didn't even have a name for the 3PL at the time, but we were making money from other people's, they want help. So in 2019 is when we decided to make it official. So GrowthJet is the name of the 3PL that we launched, and it's been fun ever since.
Very interesting. And I think it's interesting to hear that because I've heard similar stories from other 3PLs too, where they started as e-commerce brands and then, they had a poor experience with the 3PL and decided like, hey, like we're going to do this ourselves because we want to take care of our customers. We want to make sure it's done right. And then much, similar to you, it gets some word of mouth and other people are, interested as well. So, I mean, as you made that transition, talk to us a little bit about what were some of those maybe core pillars of what you wanted to provide from a service level and what was very important for you foundationally as you started to work with other brands outside of your own.
Yeah. So the first thing I realized was actually there's a lot of waste in the industry, a lot of trash. And in a way, it's inevitable, right? Because you have all the pallet wraps and everything that comes with it. But I thought that we could make a stand there. And so we actually became climate neutral certified, which meant that we offset all of our carbon footprint. And that was, and I believe we're actually the first 3PL in the world to become climate neutral certified.
Really?
And that was a stand. Yeah. And that was a value that kind of hit home with a lot of brands. And so a lot of the brands that it became like almost like an advantage because people were like, oh, this is amazing. This 3PL cares about, other things aside from the bottom line. And so the clients that we attracted were like, they were not like, I mean, it worked out because they were, not like trying to, I guess, like get the best deal. I mean, obviously we made it work with them, but like the clients that we were attracting were like more sophisticated brands that had a little bit more of a, they were not commoditized. They had a little more brand equity, so they could charge a little bit extra. And so, yeah, we were a boutique 3PL. So we're trying not to compete with the lowest prices. Like we don't want to be, competing for the cheapest because, we always try to say, hey, we are a boutique full service 3PL that essentially like the highest quality and the highest level of service. Cause that's what I felt, the pain that I felt when I was using another 3PL was the service was just non-existent. And so, yeah, that we kind of differentiated ourselves with the climate neutral angle along with the high level of service, the high touch points. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we doubled down on. So instead of focusing on like the price, we focused on the experience. And so what we always say is like, listen, you can get the cheapest prices, but if you have an experience that's like, if you want to like change up an order or like whatever it is, but like the cost will come out in other ways. And so like what we try to do is like get them to see that like, yes, we might be a little bit more expensive, but like that, the service that you'll get because of that will be way worth more than the amount of headaches and like the customer inquiries that you're going to get, right, from a lower price 3PL. So that's kind of what the way that we angled it. And so we were able to attract brands that are not like, trying to like negotiate down to every little penny, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important thing because, Oftentimes, and I've talked to a couple people who, from both sides, and, they've had those experiences where, they went for the lowest option and they were very unhappy and they had bad experiences, like you had bad experiences. And then, they decided to go with another 3PL that was a little more expensive, and a lot of those headaches went away. Right. So, I mean, it's very tough. I think sometimes you have to learn your lesson a little bit in a way to be able to understand and see that, like, hey, there's more in this than just like that price tag that I'm seeing, like right there, right? Like if you like your inventory is starting to get stolen by the employees, like in your example, there's that additional cost to figure out what's going on. And then there's that additional cost of customer dissatisfaction overall, right? And potential lost sales and potential lost customers. So it's very important to understand that. I'm curious from that perspective. I mean, do you often come across brands where, they engage with you to maybe potentially utilize your services, but then ultimately you realize like, hey, like you're just not the right fit for us? And how do you kind of navigate that?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, there have been many cases where, we would start talking to a brand and we find out that they're not the right fit. And we just tell them, hey, I don't think it's the right fit. And so a lot of times, the way we assess that, it's a little bit of an art rather than a science, but you kind of get a sense of it when you first talk to them about, when we're pitching our services and they're coming back and they're asking questions. And so a couple of examples that come to mind are like, one brand was really, they were really interested and they were like constant, asking us a ton of questions, and they were great questions, but they were so like, it was so detailed and it was, I don't know, it almost seemed like we were doing all this stuff to get all this information. And it's like, it was almost like we gave them one answer and they come back with 5 questions. We gave them, you know what I mean? Like the questions were multiplying. And like, we would do all this back and forth. I mean, we spent hours answering their, like the most like out of left field questions. But then, we found out that like last minute they'll be like, oh, actually, like, we decided, thanks for all your time, but like, I don't think it's the right fit. Like they gave us like no explanation. And so they came back to us later and was like, hey, actually, we're in the market for a 3PL again. Can you guys like
because
help us answer these questions?
Whoever they picked instead, like they had a bad experience probably, right?
Yeah, probably. And so, and then we were like, well, okay. And so we went down the path again, but then it was the same thing where they were asking like, it was just no end. Right. And so at some point we're like, all right, I don't think this is a good fit for us. And so we said no. There were other times when we would be explaining like why our prices are a little bit higher and they just could not understand the value of having a better experience. Like, to be honest with you, I think the best clients for us are ones that have experienced the other end of the spectrum, where it's like really cheap prices and they've experienced a nightmare. And then they're like, all right, clearly this is not what we need. And you almost need to experience the pain first to realize that it's not all about pick and pack prices, because literally everyone is like, what's your pick and pack prices? And it's like, that's like going to a restaurant and like asking, how much did you pay for the groceries that week? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very interesting because there is like I was just talking to a brand over the last week, and and they were talking about how they said it was a trauma experience with a 3PL. So, I mean, I think it sucks. I think that in the industry, like there's poor operators that are, giving these bad experiences to brands, and it's in turn, it's impacting those brands negatively as well. But I think, like you said, I mean, I think a lot of times it is like you have to go through that painful experience in order to be able to realize like, hey, the value in having like a good partner and not just somebody that's just providing a service for the lowest cost. So definitely, I think you have to live through that pain sometimes as the brand owner, and to be able to experience that and understand that. And I think it goes back to, especially like I think about some of my days as a warehouse manager too, and understanding like total cost of ownership versus, just the price tag around that. And I think it's great that you're able to focus on that service level, because I think it's so important within the industry and for a lot of like e-commerce brands. I mean, you have to treat, from a 3PL perspective, you have to treat their customers like they're your customers in order to be able to give them that great experience. So one of the things, I mean, I think as you've built this up, and certainly I would say at least of a lot of the online presence that I see from you on X or Twitter, is, talking about having this personal holding company and putting operators, managers in place to be able to run these businesses for you. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of that mindset and specifically around being able to delegate, because I think even if, I have some people that listen that are warehouse supervisors or warehouse managers working for other companies, a lot of times it's difficult to be able to delegate certain tasks, or at least get your mind around delegating those tasks and I guess letting go control a little bit sometimes. So tell us a little bit about how you were able to start to do that, because I did hear in your podcast at one point that you guys got busy and you were out there picking and packing orders too with everybody else. So tell us a little bit about how were you able to, I guess, first wrap your mind around the idea of like letting go of some control, and then, feeling comfortable and making sure things were in place to be able to do that.
Yeah. So this is, a really important piece that I see a lot of entrepreneurs, make this mistake, which is like, you're essentially a control freak, and you can't be that way if you want to grow your business. And so the way that I like to look at this is like, yes, you can be 100% on everything that you do, but then, get to a much smaller stage of your business, right? But then if you are 80% and you have someone and you empower your team to get you a lot further, then that's way better than, having 100% of a smaller pie versus 80% of a larger pie, right? And so it's a really big shift in mindset. But the way I like to look at it is, it's kind of like, instead of being the operator yourself, you want to become a capital allocator. And so what I mean by that is like, you want to look at your expenses, right? And so you have income coming in and then like your expenses, but then you want to be the one kind of allocating capital instead of being the one that's like in the business, right? And so when I made that shift from being the operator versus allocating capital within the business, that's really when it shifted for me. And so that's a really critical thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs make, mistake that they make. And yeah, I mean, honestly, like the delegation is something that's really changed my business. And it's not just about tasks. So a lot of people just think that, it's like, I'm doing this task, but then now I can delegate it to, I don't know, like someone else, like a virtual assistant or whatever. But it's actually a lot more than that. You need to delegate, your ideas, your decision making. Essentially, you want them to think, like, live your values. And so they can literally decide for you. And that decision is the one that you would have made yourself. And I know that's not easy, and it takes a lot of time to build that trust. But when it happens, and of course, mistakes will be made, like that is for sure. And it will be costly. Like you will probably lose money because you're trying to train up, someone else to take reins and then kind of like do all this stuff. Like there will be mistakes, but that's part of the learning. It's kind of like you're investing your resources into helping you free yourself from the business so that you can work on other bigger tasks, So yeah, I mean, honestly, it took me a while to understand that too, but I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs, they get stuck in this cycle of I want my business to run the way I want it to be. And so they never grow out of being a really small business instead of like being able to grow out into a much larger thing, right? So yeah, that's definitely an important component that I see.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great way to put it, right? Because if you get kind of stuck and lost in, I guess, in the weeds, so to speak, it's hard to like see above them and see, the future and how to get that growth going. And I think it's really interesting too that you pointed out, not only delegating like tasks, but also the kind of decision-making, idea generating types of things that are core values to you, and how do you get those transferred over to somebody? So around that sort of mindset, I mean, how do you, I guess, like if we think about, I guess you have a warehouse manager that's running the 3PL that's working there, or somebody doing day-to-day stuff. I mean, what did you look for and what would you say are like good qualities or qualifications for that type of person to have to be able to not only take on the tasks, but also, like you said, be able to think like you would and make the decisions that you would?
Yeah, so this is actually not an easy thing to do. And so really there's two ways of finding an operator that I see. One is essentially hiring someone and then training them up into that role. And this is going to take a lot longer. So this is the downside of this method, which is like, you're going to have someone who's going to be in the wings for a long time, and you're constantly testing. Like, I had a bunch of employees that I was constantly assessing, like, can this person handle the general manager job? And I'm constantly assessing it. And so that's one method. The second method is you can hire externally. So you can hire someone with more experience and bring them in, and they theoretically should be a lot more qualified and less training than someone that you train up from kind of, I guess, like homegrown talent in a way. There's pros and cons to both. Like if you hire someone from the external, then the people within the company, they're going to be like, oh, I've worked for you for 5 years. Like, I don't even get a shot at this. Yeah. It's like, so there's a lot of like politics involved in stuff too, which I'm, I am not a big politics person.
Yeah.
And so it's really, it's hard to say which method is correct, but I would say like the way that I found my operator for GrowthJet, I hired someone externally, and he wasn't like top level. He wasn't a general manager level, but he was more like, an operations person. And then I could quickly see that he was very talented. And so he rose through the ranks really quickly. But to be honest with you, like that alienated a lot of my team. And so like some people felt really hurt by that, and they became political. They felt threatened by him. And so it was like a weird phase where eventually like, he rose through the ranks, and now he's my general manager, and he's the best one that I've had. And so it was worth it. But at the same time, like I did lose a lot of, people that were kind of in the wings a little bit, and they were hoping that they would get the chance. And, to be honest, I'm constantly assessing talent. And so in a way I did give them chances, but I just felt like they weren't quite there. Whereas this guy, I feel, he's really solid. And so, yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, but I guess from my side, I'm always assessing different talent. And so whether or not I bring someone from the external or I'm evaluating people internally, I'm always seeing who the best one, best person for the job is, and trying to challenge them and elevate them to a new role. And I'm doing this constantly, right? So yeah, it's like it's more of an art than a science.
Yeah, it's interesting, and because I think it is something that's, like you said, I mean, it's challenging to be able to figure out who is the right person, and like you said, it's a balance of do we go internal, do we go external, and It's hard, I think, internally, especially in kind of a warehouse fulfillment setting too, where, maybe I think a lot of times the mind goes to, oh, this person is the fastest picker, the fastest packer, so they should get elevated, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean they have those leadership skills, right?
Right.
So I think it's interesting how you kind of go about that, and how you said you're continuously assessing, which I think makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting to hear about how you kind of weave through all of this and kind of made this happen to where you are now. And I really appreciate you giving all these insights and coming on the show and talking to us about your different businesses and the 3PL especially, and how that came about, and how you've put such a focus on the service level because of your bad experience, bad customer experience, right? And it makes sense to be able to do that. I'm happy we could share that story today on the podcast with our audience and learn a little bit more from you as well. So if people are interested in getting in touch with you, learning more from you, I know you have a couple of different ways to do that. I think you have a podcast, a newsletter, big on X and Twitter. And I think I saw you pop up on LinkedIn too recently as well. So tell us a little bit about what's the best way to connect with you and learn more from you.
Yeah, so I publish a lot of content. I have a podcast called First Class Founders. And so that's also the newsletter. So if you go to firstclassfounders.com, you'll see the latest episodes and all that. I'm pretty active on X/Twitter at Yong-Soo Chung. That's YONGSOOCHUNG. And then if you're curious to learn more about my 3PL, it's GrowthJet. So GrowthJet.com.
All right. Awesome. And we will definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it. So Yong-Soo, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us. Always great to hear these stories and learn from people that are out there in the field doing the thing and learning from doing those things. So really appreciate your time on the show. Thank you once again.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.